Look, before we dive into this next video, we have to understand that all the leaks that supposedly are hitting the mainstream uh, may just be controlled as well. Maybe that's something they wanted us to know to spook the markets, spook the people. I don't know. So with that big grain of salt, we look at this article. Reserve Bank considered asking for real estate transaction pause amid property crash fears. Now, this is old news. It's been a couple of weeks. I remember my mother calling me and saying they want to pause, real estate, which to ordinary person normally, including myself, would mean what? They're going to stop sales of real estate. They're going to ban sales of real estate. I mean, to be honest, they've banned you going out freely, walking around without any symptoms. Why couldn't they just ban uh, real estate transactions, buying, selling real estate, right? Houses, because anything's possible. It's 2020, and again, they've locked us down in our own homes for 3 months or so and closed internal administrative borders. So why can't they do that? So I thought I'm going to look into this, and that's what I did back then. But this is the extent of the control and the extent of example of the extent how much they want us to be blind to what's going on. Yet again, this leak made it into the mainstream. So again, you got to take it with a grain of salt, but it's actually very interesting. But before that, I want to show you some of the comments. I mean, one of the comments from MTD says a surge in cases because the tests are corrupt. Notice how they don't refer to the death rate. That's actually very interesting that when you think about it, they're saying, oh, the new cases, but what about the death rate from those new cases or the deaths overall, which potentially are going up, but they're not concentrating on deaths. They're concentrating on huge increase in number of cases. Okay, so we are still in June. It's 30th of June 2020. This was 18th June 2020. So it says speaking notes for RBA Assistant Governor Economic Lucy, or is it Luke Ellis, contained a severe warning about the housing market. Reserve Bank economists considered urging the federal government to shut down the real estate industry, pausing sales of established homes to avoid perceptions of coronavirus-inspired housing market crash. Before I continue on, I don't know how I never mentioned it. Uh, the One of the ex-neighbors of mine I still keep in touch with. He works for the building company, and he's saying exactly what one of the paragraphs is saying here. So I'm going to jump to that paragraph. This one line here says contracts are being cancelled. Early stage buyer interest is very weak, and the pipeline is emptying. It noted. That was the notes. That's what he said to me out in the field. That people didn't have to put down big deposits for these new house builds, and they were happy to pull out of these deals with maybe losing $10,000 or so, knowing that if they went ahead with it, they would lose a lot more. The house that is being built would be less than worth much less than what they paid for. So losing 10 grand wasn't an issue, and they keep doing it. He works for one of the big building companies in Sydney here. So the article, which obviously I'm going to leave a link in the description below, documents from inside Australia's central bank, including many marked highly restricted, also suggest house prices could slump up to 15%. You wish. The internal reports contradict a much rosier public view the Reserve Bank of Australia has been displaying about the billions of dollars and millions of jobs tied up in housing, construction, real estate. So, in public, they tell you one thing, internally, they are panicking. One thing I do like is that these internal notes were obtained through a Freedom of Information request. Or so there's a Freedom of Information Act that apparently anyone can request if you check the right boxes and go through the process. So it's become clear that there's been a big drop-off in demand for new housing, said speaking notes for Assistant Governor Economic Lucy Ellis, which were obtained through the Freedom of Information request. So I all of a sudden this article is rising in its credibility, because it may actually have leaked out organically. It hasn't, may have not been planted there for us to be leaked out to the masses and then for us to see it. So the thing here is that if you can't get a certain market to go your way, meaning that if you can't get housing to keep going up, if it keeps going down, well, why not just stop reporting it? So people who are buying it can not form informed decision as to what a specific sale price of a house is. So what they would do with this is that they would stop recording it. So if the house that was sold back, say 4 or 5 years ago during the peak, sold for $1 million and then it got sold for $800,000 just recently, if somebody was buying it next year, they wouldn't know that the last sale was $800,000. They would just see before the freeze of the information that that was worth $1 million and that they would have to go off of that information, not the actual latest sale price of $800,000, which is just insane. Again, brings me to the example of if you want to buy a share of Telstra and they don't tell you what it is, or they tell you what it was, 10 years ago when a share of Telstra was $6, yet the last sale here right now was maybe $3.10. So you're running blind. They don't want you to be informed. That goes without saying. That informed buyer is not a good buyer. Whether you're buying a car or a house, or it's much bigger, being informed about anything and everything that affects your future and finances, the less you know, the better for them. The easier they can sell you the narratives and scare the living daylights out of you with the CV. So the article says, it goes on to say, a sharp fall in house prices is predicted in a note marked highly restricted and created on April 18th. So in this same April report, in an April report marked highly restricted, the Reserve Bank warned the construction industry was staring at a cliff. Also back in April, economist Nick Garvin said, I think it's dangerous for regulators to be reporting on housing prices as though the market is currently functioning. Reporting, you're just reporting, you're not, if, unless you just want to keep everything secret, including any transactions, including stock market, and you just have to kind of stab in the dark when you're putting your bid in as to what you want to pay for a certain stock, and then see if it catches the bid, if somebody sells it for that, and the next person who comes along doesn't know what your bid was and what that stock sold for, which means that we're all running absolutely completely blind. And the pinnacle of this deception would be this statement: I'd suggest we classify the market as paused and treat the prices observed before the pause as the current prices, like how equity markets operate, but on a larger scale. Again, meaning that whatever was recorded at the peak, that's what we know the prices to be, no matter what actually happened in the last 6, 12, 18, 24 months, where somebody actually paid less and somebody was willing to sell for less. No, you're not going to know that information. We're just going to give you the information that suits our narrative and our tax collection purposes. They do go one step further. I actually didn't read this whole article before I presented it to you. The pause would not mean that there was no activity, he wrote. Although it could indeed be wise to recommend that the government temporarily halt all sales of established dwellings, meaning that they're not only going to stop reporting, but it could be possible and maybe even advisable for government to stop all the sales, ban all the sales. I mean, how do you do it? Just think about cars. I want to sell a car, and if the same thing they wanted to do with a car, I can't buy a car. Well, I just want to sell a car. I don't need it. They say, no, you're not allowed to sell a car. Like, this is 1984. 1984, the novel by George Orwell. There was a comment, COVID is our version of the war in the novel 1984, a constantly changing narrative to emotionally manipulate the people. That was one of the comments from MTD. And I appreciate all the comments. I read all of them. I just haven't got time to reply. Apologies. See, they think you are not capable of making your own decisions. They think of you as absolute sheep, because the statement continues on to say, if people start mistakenly thinking that we're experiencing a housing market crash, it's not going to help things, he added. Mistakenly, again, if a house that was sold for $1 million, there was a seller who actually now wanted to sell it for $700,000 and somebody was willing to buy it for that same price, is called free market. What people are going to think about it is what they're going to think about it. Are you saying you're going to try to manipulate what people think? Um, yeah. In Melbourne, some of RBA's contacts have seen new home sales drop by half.
In its latest quarterly update, the Commonwealth Bank revealed it set aside a large pile of cash to cover expected housing losses, despite the housing market holding up for now. Australia's biggest bank has forecast a worst-case scenario which would see house prices plunge by a third in a prolonged downturn. Capital city house prices are still around 10% higher than a year ago, but CBA says 9% unemployment and a 7% fall in GDP could see house prices down 32% by March 2023.
Now, the only thing I have to add is, all the people, the immigration that happened before this, and the students and the working visas and the educational dollar that came mostly from China, definitely from Asia. It's not there anymore. Those people are not flocking in like they used to. The demand for everything is going to drop. I mean, until they reopen the borders to overseas travelers and students, I can't see it recovering. I'm not just being a perma bear. You look around and the city is emptier, the streets are emptier, which some people are cherishing, to be honest. The natives here, the people have been here for a long time, established. I mean, there's just not as much of queues everywhere. The traffic's picked up somewhat, but again, you want to get a house to buy a house, it's easier. You don't have to jump over each other to buy a house. You don't have to certainly jump over each other to rent a place. There's plenty of places and the prices are dropping. So, I mean, for ordinary people who already live here, is that what you want? Or do you want like $400,000 flooding every year? $400,000, 400,000 people flooding in every year and just competing with, for your jobs. I mean, that's how we all came here. I know it's hypocritical, but um, it is much, much harder now if you were to come into this city to get a job that pays you decent, because the housing really have gone, double, quadruple in this many years, and the people are still getting paid $15, $20 an hour for those basic jobs. I mean, that's just not on, you know. It doesn't help them. It doesn't help people who are here. It's just stuffing people in and trying to resuscitate this economy with these false numbers where the GDP is growing or was growing, but only because you were bringing people in. But per capita, the GDP was dropping, means that per person in this country, we are less productive. And that's what tells you. I mean, you can cram in 50 million people, and guess what? That'll double the GDP. But per capita, per person, that GDP will drop, meaning that each person is less valuable to this economy, and brings less demand, and obviously spends less into it. And this being a consumer economy, that's just not good for it long term. Clearly, the RBA was very worried about the housing market at the beginning of April. Look, there has been times in the past where RBA has come out with statements that were worried about prices. I think back in the early 2000s, that was the case, and that didn't stop the price from going up and up and up. But the famous four words in English language, it is different this time. Is it really, or will the house prices just run away like crazy? I don't know on the back of what. In the real terms, I don't know how, because it just means that people will keep the jobs, which they're not for most part, and will be able to borrow a lot of money, which is tightening. So the supply is tightening. So I can't see it, but I couldn't see it 10 years ago. So, I might be perpetually be wrong, myself and many other channels that I'm sure the viewers of this channel are following as well. And I appreciate that. So I'll paste the link to this article if you haven't read it yet, and wish you a good day on this last day of the financial year 2020. And we want to see it behind us. It's 30th of June 2020. Have a good day. Talk to you soon. Bye for now.